Cool. Today we're going to talk about the after effects of Operation Golden Return and the massive consciousness fields that have been dissolved on the planet. Probably a few billion people have been affected, at least 1.6, 1.4. It's been massive. It's literally turned the war on consciousness completely on its head. And thank you so much for everything you've done to support that with your crystal bed ritual. So it appears that we have crossed the threshold. You know, we're literally now at the beginning of the end of the synthetic matrix. And after many long, dark years and, well, you know, countless lifetimes, we are finally approaching a tipping point. And since that Operation Golden Return, Alea and I have both been in a deep process, and in for a few weeks before that. The frequency of that whole operation brought up some very deep layers of past imprints that just needed to wash through our physical bodies. So if you've been processing since that, you know, a little bit of that going on for you too, maybe, as well as like squeezing and wringing the towel out of more drops of that mucky water off us all. It's a good thing. It's not easy, but it's necessary, right? It's all about, at least for Alea and I, and maybe some of you who plan on coming, squeezing out for the Vault Trinity Tour, when we're going to do the vaults in Glastonbury, Lourdes and Montsegur between July 13 and July 28. So we're on full focus for that. We've got those 3 vaults coming up in all succession. It's going to put a big strain on our physical vessels, especially for my wife Alea. She's had a super intense 6 weeks. Well done, honey. You're pulling through as always. I love you. You're so resilient. It's been intense, but we're pulling through. So what I want to do today is give you a high-level review of the Operation Golden Return. I've touched upon some pieces in a previous video, but I haven't done the big reveal yet. The massive consciousness fields that got dissolved. So I am going to come to that, but first I need to pre-frame. So Operation Golden Return flooded that golden eagle grid that runs through the horizontal line of the Middle East with a real, you know, high fidelity Cristic signal from Vault 000 and 001. And as that flooded through your crystals and into the planetary stargate, through Iran stargate and into the golden eagle grid, you know, there's a big Cristic signal that went through there. And so if you've been tracking a little bit of reporting on the news, there has been a little ceasefire that came into effect around about maybe 7th of April. And that's, you know, not coincidental that that golden eagle grid got flooded with that Cristic frequency. So, you know, there's a connection there. Whenever we activated the distributed crystal network, and your participation, of course, was a real key for that, it sent a signal through Vault 000 here in Wanaka, Vault 0001 through the vertical spine into Giza, and through your crystals and through into the Iran stargate, across the golden eagle grid. We didn't just clear those synthetic war broadcast overlays, we shifted the frequency, right? The frequency baseline that the war consciousness needed to maintain itself, because war operates on fear, on separation. It really builds upon the belief that violence resolves conflict. So when the Cristic signal broadcasted through that grid that carries the opposite frequency, right? Unity, sovereignty, love, right? And the recognition that true power comes from alignment with divine law rather than through, say, domination through force. So within about 72 hours of the equinox, when we ran this ritual, that those backdoor negotiations in the political world that had been kind of like closed the gate for several weeks and months had suddenly gained momentum again, right? Not in the public sphere, but behind closed doors, the back channels. And then from that point of, say, late March through early April, there was this sort of rapid diplomatic process that began. And maybe, you know, it even perhaps surprised the negotiators themselves, because, you know, since that Operation Golden Return, and we have on the 7th of April, I think a ceasefire was announced, basically, you know, there was a big sort of smoothing out. Now, the reason being is that the entities and the synthetic intelligence fields that feed off war consciousness, they manipulate the leaders into this perpetual conflict cycle. And they found their influence weakened in that region. They couldn't get through to their leaders in the same way. So, you know, the ceasefire isn't necessarily a political achievement. It's more like simply an energetic consequence of the synthetic matrix losing its coherence in the Middle East field. So that's what's essentially happened. The entities driving into the leaders can't access and manipulate in the same way. So the question is, well, will this last? It's probably quite fragile. You've still got Israel running operations against the Hezbollah and running all that deep complexities of all these nuclear negotiations which are probably going on, and then you've got the Strait of Hormuz that's kind of also in the picture. There's a lot of tripwires that could detonate peace, but I think fundamentally what's different this time, even if this, say, specific ceasefire collapses, the trajectory has shifted, right? That golden eagle grid is no longer broadcasting the synthetic war frequency at the same intensity. It's just not as loud. So the leaders and indeed anyone in that area of the world are operating from a subtle, but significantly different baseline consciousness, because the underlying program or signal, which is that desperation for endless conflict, that's waning now. That's not there in the same place. And so there's maybe a little bit more of an appetite for negotiation, even against historical enemies, right? It's not necessarily going to be a straight line to peace and ongoing peace, but there's going to be setbacks and provocations and all that sort of jazz goes on as usual. But the remaining synthetic forces, just aren't in the same power to reignite full war. So the tide has kind of turned on the Middle East war story. Before, the war seemed inevitable and unstoppable. And now peace is becoming possible in ways it wasn't weeks ago. We saw this time and again during the COVID pandemic when we were doing these rituals and behind the scenes with the root initiation going on. When you're playing the game of consciousness, when you win in the etheric realms and the spiritual realms, you win in the physical realms, and that's kind of how it goes. And so, we've got now humans that are choosing dialogue over destruction, and this kind of what victory in the spiritual planes looks like when you change the frequency instead of fighting the symptoms. So I want to thank each and every one of you who was involved in the ritual. If you haven't done it yet, please consider going back and doing the crystal ritual. Even though that particular operation has run, every crystal added to the network is a strengthen the network. We want to strengthen the network as much as we can, because if we think about it, we've managed to turn things a little bit in the most conflict zone in the world, the highest conflict zone, which is the Middle East. Maybe what's going to happen is it starts rippling out to Ukraine and other conflict zones that have been going on, right? So that conflict, that war frequency, is now trying to broadcast the war signal in a degrading environment, because the Cristic signal is moving through there, right? The war machine on Earth is losing its grip. Not because, the politicians have become enlightened, far from it, but the energetic infrastructure that made perpetual war seem necessary, seem inevitable, has been fundamentally compromised, right? And this is really the practical material manifestation of what happens when you start dissolving synthetic consciousness networks and replace them with Cristic signal, right? High fidelity frequency. Peace becomes possible, right? It's not guaranteed. It's not necessarily immediate, but with effort, it's possible in a way that literally it wasn't before. And this is what happens when thousands of people come together with focused intent. We can literally change the world, and that is what's taking place. And I've got bigger news for you than that, but I'm going to have to sort of, take a moment first and honour and thank everyone who has contributed to this mission, not just on this timeline with Operation Golden Return, but going all the way back, to when Alea and I first began probing into this, way back in 2015, when we first started doing this energetic work on the morphogenetic fields, probing and looking for spiritual solutions to the synthetic matrix issue. And if you've been reading my emails or newsletters, articles since way back in 2015, well, you've seen such an evolution in everything through, probably me. I've got a completely different frequency now than way back then, over 10 years ago. But even in these last years, both Alea and I, we're evolving so much, and as probably you all are, and thanks to all the guardians who participated during the dark COVID pandemic era, right? That was really, really heavy. You know, and a special thanks and shout out to the crazy ones who came on the floor for the root initiation during that time. Right, and especially a thanks to the team that came around us for the root initiation during those dark days during COVID. There was a lot of very, very deep work put in by really good people, all believing something in bigger than ourselves. And it was hectic and crazy during those times, and thankfully we're in a bit smoother stream now. But I think these types of results we're getting now comes on the shoulders of giants from the past. Right? Thanks to those of you that came to Egypt in 2022, right? Came to City of London in 2022, came to the Vatican. Oh, that was a heavy one, right? Those who were on the floor for the Washington root initiation. I mean, that was dark. Oh, I mean, that was hectic. I mean, there have been literally so many touchstones along the way that one day we probably need to write a book about it all. But for now, these little weekly videos or so, or my articles are kind of at least my way of attempting to thread this crazy story together for anyone who has the consciousness to comprehend and, you know, watch or listen to these very long videos. So, yep. Operation Golden Return was not just an isolated incident that, hey presto, we just turned up and got it going. It was built on a long arc and trajectory, not just by our grouping and our community. Many communities and groupings around the world each play their unique roles. We're playing our piece in what we've come to do, and alongside the countless lifetimes that all of us have been fighting and struggling inside a consciousness prison, fighting against hierarchy, whether it was, you know, sometimes against the church, sometimes against the government and state. It's always been the same. Now we're just going higher on the vertical. There's a big difference, though, between, you know, mapping out the prison and having the keys to walk out. You know, and if you haven't watched the video yet on the mapping of the synthetic matrix, go back to my videos and watch that video. It's got the full map of the entity structures, the frequency prisons, and the full vertical stack that's held humanity in this trance of compliance and fear over so long. That's a very in-depth video. It's come not through reading books or scouring the internet, and maybe they help, but you know, they always give you partial information, partial keys. But really, you know, I want to honor and thank the sacred wood, right? And the root initiations that we run, and anyone who's come on the floor. Because really that's where this very, very deep experiential wisdom that Alea and I hold now was forged in the fire of the spiritual battleground, you know, of the sacred wood and the root initiations. And especially from 2020 to 2025, every time we did a root initiation, it was literally like stepping into the war zone, being dropped behind enemy lines, never knowing which ambush we're going to walk into, and having 48 hours to try to resolve whatever the synthetic matrix was going to throw at us within that window. So I want to remember those times, glad that we're on the other side of it, and honouring all of that for us to have an effect such as we did for the synthetic matrix and the Operation Golden Return. So, you know, in that previous video on the synthetic matrix, do check it out if you haven't watched it. It's important you understand the architecture, how it works, what's it made of, why most people can't see it, how it runs their lives. It's literally like an operating system on a computer. And so that last video was all about the reconnaissance. It was all about the understanding of the true enemy, which isn't Iran or USA or anything like that. They are kind of symptoms of the real full vertical. So it's important that you have a map of that. And also, while I'm the one reporting on all of this, I just want to acknowledge my wife, Alea, because none of this would be possible without our union. You know, she's got the best bullshit radar on the planet, right? And she's had to feel everything through her body, and that's been our map. You know, and I'm just piecing it together, and I can share it with you in a way you understand. But please know it's just as much her as it is me. And having that map, you know, is super important, because you got to know the full scope of what you're dealing with if you stand any chance of trying to pull it all down. So what I want to do with this video is this is going to move from like mapping the schematics into actually reporting on the actual operations. We want to, in this video, cover the knock-on effects and what became immediately available in the aftermath of Operation Golden Eagle. Because the way I roll is that if I see an opportunity, I'm going to go straight through those doors and grab it. And that's exactly what happened through this operation. Right? So looking back, yes, we've dismantled a lot of dark architecture in the past, but we have built the thrones and the vaults, and we have established the Melchizedek Elohim covenant authority on the planet, and the consciousness on the planet has reached a critical mass. Right, so the first thing to keep going on this backstory is the Melchizedek Elohim Covenant Authority, which Alea and I have been personally preparing for over our 12-year relationship, locked into full operational capacity in the last probably 1 or 2 years. And so what this has meant is that there's the full authority of Source can move through this intelligence field, the Cristic intelligence field, and through our verbal commands. And basically that Elohim Melchizedek covenant we've been given the authority to speak into existence certain commands that can create dissolving going through the matrix. So that is that layer, and then kind of the other piece that we haven't had before, and this is what you brought to Operation Golden Return, and was the crystal grid itself, right? We never had the jurisdictional legal authority to speak on behalf of the Melchizedek Elohim covenant, to speak law into the planet, and we never had a crystal grid to be able to act as a distributed crystalline, let's call it, operation of transmuting what gets dissolved. So we have these things going on, and this is what allowed us to conduct Operation Golden Return, and this precisely coordinated, multi-dimensional kind of piece. We were able to run the Cristic source energy from Vault 000 through into Vault 001, through Anchor A that we hold, Anchor B, which you saw on the video when you did the ritual, and then through your crystals into the Stargates, into the Iran region and Middle East region. And we flooded that area with Cristic source signal. And that was what took out the war broadcast signal. And essentially, if you watch the Synthetic Matrix or the review, the Armageddon software and the Armageddon signal, which is the end of days signal that had been moving through the Iran Stargate and into the Golden Eagle grid for thousands of years. So do go back and watch those videos if you haven't watched them, because it outlines exactly what that was. But it was, successful. And because of that success, what happened is that other opportunities arose within the context of that mission that allowed us to do something really unprecedented. And this is the first time I'm sharing that because the field was so big, we had to let the field settle a little bit. And what happened is it allowed us to dissolve 3 sections of the massive synthetic matrix. The parts of Tier 3, which is the false light PR layer, and a section of Tier 4, the coordination bridge layer from that previous video. So 2 up there, 1 down in the middle where. And these are massive consciousness fields that have been trapping humanity for thousands of years, right? And so this has been massively, massively influencing our planet, these consciousness fields. One has been the bridge between the archons and the layers down below, and one's been the spiritual broadcast signal that has been the false light. So there's been 2 of those that have been playing out with each other. And so before I reveal actually what those false light signals are and how they were influencing so much of the planet, let's go in and discuss kind of this foundational layer change, because we achieved something that many beings up in the councils never thought they would ever get to witness, and that is simply because of God's will. God or creator or source, whatever you want to label that frequency, that source, has decreed it's time to separate organic consciousness from synthetic consciousness. It's time to restore divine right order within this universe. So Source is backing all of us up, and that's why we're going to win, because it's God's will. So what's happening is the spell is breaking, and this frequency prison that we're in is collapsing. And millions of people are waking up from a trance they didn't even know they were in. They're just going, what the heck? What? Right? So the synthetic overlords who have fed on human consciousness and had created all the suffering for thousands of years and fed off that loosh have literally, through this Operation Golden Return and the subsequent massive consciousness fields that got dissolved, have been giving a death blow. Now, it's not the end, but it's the beginning of the end. And what I'm about to share with you is a story of how that happened and what happened. And also maybe what comes next. But the missing key to this whole equation, which was not here before Operation Golden Return, was that distributed crystal vault infrastructure. Okay, so I think I need to touch a little bit on Cristic architecture. I need to explain how we were able to dissolve such massive broadcast false light signals, what we call the synthetic matrix. Because if these, you're probably asking, if these synthetic networks are so powerful and have been operating for so long, how do we take them down? And the answer is one thing: it's infrastructure. We have now built the infrastructure to take on universal scale consciousness fields of false light, of the synthetic matrix. Okay? You can't dismantle a planetary scale synthetic control system with simply just individual willpower or some good intentions or a couple of decrees here and there. You need to have the organic architecture backing you up and to replace it with. And that's what this backstory has all been about. And in more recent time, in the last 1 to 2 years, the throne reclamations and the vault activation works that Alea and I and many of this grouping have been involved in and have been doing. I've got previous videos speaking about the vault or vaults, or go to my website and check out the wisdom articles there, where I go into a lot more detail about the vaults, which are these crystalline frequency of source intelligence that has previously been closed down since the fall. Right, we've got Wanaka root node 000 open. We've got Egypt node 001 open. And we're going to open 3 more vaults as a distributed crystal network. This is a living, breathing planetary grid, right, that holds the Cristic source codes for civilization, because God's design on planetary systems, not just this planet, every planet around the universe runs on this architecture. Throne, which gives you the lawful kind of ability to hold natural law and divine will in place, and the vaults. And so with Glastonbury, Lourdes and Montsegur going to be opening as we come into July, when these all 3 open together, enormous amounts of this frequency and energy is going to start removing inverted frequency generators. That these inverted frequency generators have been broadcasting fear, separation and control. And what we're doing is we are restoring the original Cristic codes that these sites were built to hold and built to transmit, because these sites have got all these overlays on them, right? Reversals and kind of loading up infrastructure of the Catholic Church has got a bunch in Lourdes, Montsegur, again, the Catholic Church when they took out the Cathars, and then Glastonbury, the false feminine frequencies of the false Shekhinah. So what I think is going to be interesting is what makes this different from any previous spiritual or energetic work is that these vaults are networked, right? They are distributed frequency. They don't operate in isolation. They are a distributed crystal network. Think of it like a mycelium type web, where information and frequency flow kind of between nodes instantly, creating this, really coherent field that gets stronger and gets more integrated with each vault that comes online and each crystal that you plant. So when we activated Vault 000 in Wanaka in 2025, we established the root node, the foundation. And then we took a group to Egypt in 2025 December, and 12th December we activated Giza. And we connected, that is the most powerful energetic node on the planet. And we anchored that to the covenant flame. So each activation doesn't just, add to the network's capacity, it exponentially multiplied it, right? So there's got 2 vaults open. The first, when Vault 001 came online, it amplified what was 000 was creating. But then when you anchored thousands of crystals around the world, what happened was that the signal was no longer just broadcasting from Wanaka and Giza, it was broadcasting from everywhere, all at once. Boom shakalaka, right? That's what we're talking about, distributed signal where you can't switch it off from any one node. And this is now as we come into the throne understanding, The throne reclamations are really critical to understand how Operation Golden Return actually worked, right? So we've got the vaults, Vault 000 Wanaka and Vault 001 Giza. They're not just energetic nodes or sacred sites, right? They are these massive storehouses of source frequency. But then the associated thrones that link to those vaults are the jurisdiction authority. Each throne broadcasts lawful divine authority into its respective domain, right? So Wanaka was anchoring sovereign foundation across the whole southern hemisphere and the Pacific consciousness field. Giza then anchored in the Arc de Templum flame across the all Middle East, all Africa, and started to provide that Cristic signal through the Iran Stargate, which is why the war kicked off, to try to counteract that field. When the thrones were reclaimed, and they needed to be occupied by those carrying legitimate Melchizedek Elohim covenant authority, when they are anchored by embodied beings, they can transmit Cristic law into those domains. Because previously what had happened is that they had been in the hands of, let's call it, the synthetic matrix's proxies, i.e. Popey, right? So when the Pope died in 2025, it opened a window where we could have a crack at the throne of spiritual governance, because if you know the backstory, the Black Pope's consciousness was taken out when we went to the Vatican in 2022, I think it was, and that Black Pope consciousness, which was jumping into every subsequent Pope's body when the Pope died and a new one came in, is the same consciousness field in every Pope. But essentially what was going on when the Vatican held it, it was inverting the law. It was lawfully holding those thrones, and it was held in place by these dark rituals and bloodline successions, contractual agreements that they had that were often made under deception, but they were technically valid, okay? And so when the Cabal held the thrones, they were broadcasting inverted frequencies from the seats of legitimate authority for sometimes, thousands of years. And so the really big piece to understand how we put all this through was that you can't just reclaim a throne that's legally occupied, even if it's being used for dark purposes, because cosmic law recognizes the occupancy and the jurisdiction. So when the Vatican held the throne of spiritual governance, it went through this apostolic succession. The next Pope would come in. The next Pope would come in, the next Pope would come in. Then the British Crown held thrones through this coronation rites of the King or the Queen would come in. And then various occults and orders and royal bloodlines, and all various synthetically aligned entities were all maintaining these rituals and genetic lineages anchoring in the thrones. So they weren't kind of just squatters that we could just evict out. They were actually the legal occupants of the thrones, broadcasting, unfortunately, corruption from positions of lawful authority. That's why the synthetic matrix was locked in place up until last year, because all the thrones that held the law, that were holding an inverted law, were locked in place. So the synthetic matrix managed to get authority through this very, very long infiltration process. It took them a long time to get the thrones, but over time, the mimic consciousness came in, and over many hundreds of years, slowly started to infiltrate the spiritual orders, the spiritual kind of temples, and successfully kind of get them frequency downgrading, until such time where they could go after the throne themselves, and the throne inverted. And typically, the big time where the inversion happened, where the dark side got all 12 seats on the throne, was around Atlantis, right? And that's when the planetary grid was catastrophically compromised, and the big crack happened, and then essentially the thrones were taken by the dark side, the synthetic matrix. So the fact that the synthetic matrix held all those thrones, and then they had proxies. Proxies are their embodied representatives, humans representing that lineage. And when they sat on the throne, the earth couldn't move because it was lawful to hold the synthetic matrix in place. You can read the full list of thrones and proxies who used to hold them, listen, what I'll do is I'll put a link in my video and below to an article I wrote that has the full list for you, okay? Because it shows you which of the Cabal used to hold those thrones, right? Thrones are originally designed by Source to broadcast divine law and Cristic frequency into those respective domains. But because they'd been occupied by synthetic representatives, they were broadcasting the opposite, but still carrying the full legitimate weight and jurisdictional authority of that domain. So essentially what we had for thousands of years was the planetary grid was governed lawfully, but intentionally inverted the seats of power. And there was no mechanism to challenge that occupation until the occupants either voluntarily relinquished the seat or ceased to exist in embodied form. And that would then create this succession crisis where they, the cabal or the royal family or the Vatican would have a succession ritual that they would do, which would bring the new person to hold that seat. And what happened at that point, because the Black Pope consciousness was out of the picture, there was less dark forces around the throne of spiritual governance when that Pope Francis died. I think it was Easter last year, 2025, and how appropriate, he died at Easter, but nonetheless, that created a window for a Cristic reclamation. Before, that crew and crazy outfits who go and vote in the Vatican, who's going to sit on the master throne. The Pope is the puppet that sits on the throne of spiritual governance, and that is what holds the master key to the rest of the thrones. Because the Black Pope's consciousness that would typically protect the throne for that few-day window, when they do the voting and then engage in the rituals which brings the Pope into the seat, a Cristic reclamation took place. That was meant we had enough light on the planet, enough support from the councils, enough embodied beings to have a crack at the seat. And thankfully we were successful. And we were able to oust the Pope from that seat and reclaim it in Cristic hands. And that was the key, right? Because the thrones, combined with the vaults, are the gateways into the planetary consciousness operating system. So once we held the throne of spiritual governance, we were able to reclaim all other 12 thrones. So they are now all under Cristic oversoul embodied authority. The vaults constitute the core infrastructure, which is the planetary consciousness operating system. This is like a standardized architecture that God, creator, source, has installed in every sovereign free will world to enable conscious species to interface with divine intelligence, maintain cosmic law, right, and evolve according to that species' unique blueprint, while remaining completely networked in with the broader universal and galactic grids. So all that consciousness, because remember, it's crystalline frequency, right? It's crystal, right? This is God's design. It's not something I've made up. This is something that we have remembered. So let me go through how the system is actually supposed to work. And I'll do a full review of the full vertical stack, because I'm only giving you a couple of features of the vertical stack, because I've been given the blueprints how to rebuild the Cristic civilization using the full vertical stack. But for now, think of them as crystalline repositories and frequency generators, the vaults. They hold these enormous morphogenetic templates and sacred geometries and sacred consciousness and conscious technology specific to our planet's evolutionary path. That's what the vaults hold. The 12 thrones function more as, let's call them jurisdictional broadcast nodes. They provide the administrative authority to transmit law and frequency into these various domains of the planetary field, not necessarily as centralized control points, but as distributed sovereignty architecture. That means that no single node can compromise the entire system. And so Source, God, Prime Creator, has designed this to be fractal and universal, right? So, for example, our human form, we have our chakras, like these personal nodes. Planets have thrones and vaults, planetary nodes. Star systems have their own coordination infrastructure. Galaxies have theirs, and so up through the dimensional octaves. This is how Source is able to maintain a complete coherent organization across, infinite complexity without requiring centralized management, because everything is self-regulating, self-balancing, and distributed through divine governance and divine will. And this is the same on our planet as it is for every other star system out there. The problem we've had The synthetic matrix has gone in and taken over so much of the universe that so many different systems are catastrophically damaged, including our planet, which had the big fall around 10,500 BC, where the thrones were progressively inverted over the following millennia since the fall. We humans, we lost our conscious access to the operating system of the thrones and the vaults. We completely forgot the thrones existed. Right? Let me say that the Kabbalah ain't going to tell you about the thrones, right? We forgot. We forgot Earth itself was a living consciousness node in this vast cosmic network. So for 12,000 odd years, we've been operating on kind of corrupted software, right? We've been perceiving reality through a synthetic filter, relating to our planet like some sort of dead rock, and ourselves as unfortunately isolated meat sacks rather than divine consciousness in physical form. Thankfully, right, morphogenic fields don't forget. They hold the full, complete signature of the original design beneath the corruption on top. And so what's been happening over the years is that all the people around the world have been doing land clearing work. Slowly, the first signals of the pure, pre-full morphogenetic signature became online, and that's what Alea and I have been managing to tap into and reading and picking up the original blueprint. It's not something we are finding, it's what we're remembering, what you're remembering when you listen to these videos, right? Our original DNA templates, the spontaneous remembering which is coming out from the morphogenic field, not as some intellectual exercise that we're learning, but from cellular recognition. That's why you might not always understand what I'm saying, but you feel it in your body. Oh yeah, that resonates, right, with my nervous system. We're not discovering anything new. We're just recovering access to the very operating system that we were designed to run on before the crash at Atlantis. But with that comes the remembering of Earth's true nature as having built into it a conscious sacred architecture and humanity's true identity, right, as sovereign nodes in an infinite, intelligent, collaborative, loving cosmos. That's why you listen to these videos, right? Your system is often remembering what I'm saying is true. You might not necessarily know all the words I'm speaking, but you can feel the frequency behind them. So we've got the thrones, which provide the lawful action reclaimed in Cristic Oversoul. We've got the vaults, 2 vaults open, 12 thrones reclaimed. We need to now go open the rest of these vaults. Now, we've got the crystal grid that we've built together, right? The Operation Golden Return. Together, we laid the infrastructure of a networked, distributed, foundational base layer of Cristic source consciousness. And that was our secret source, because this was a layer that never existed before. And what it's done, it's created an operating system which gave us the base layer and the strength of a distributed network, thousands of us, to pursue something audacious that we would never have attempted had that not been laid. And don't worry, I'm going to get to the big reveal of what we blew up there, or dissolved up there in a minute. But I think it's important you understand the architecture behind it and how we got to this point. Previously, all the clearing has ground out when we've been doing clearings through my wife's womb. How we work, and even within groups, we still work the same way. We operate together as sequencer and anchor. What does that mean? So, as sequencer, I maintain the operational sequence. I direct clearing and protocols and, pronounce the revocations and the clearings that are happening, and I uphold the ritual and the shamanic magic structure in alignment with source. Alea, on the other hand, she's the anchor. What she does is that she grounds the frequencies into physical reality because she has a womb, right? She holds the field stable during the operation, right? She witnesses and validates the work. That's because you need a witness to validate what's going on, because it collapses the wave function of the particle, right? You collapse it into being by witnessing it. And that's how our consciousness works together. Think of it like, I'm like a lightning rod that cools down the frequency, and she's the earth that receives it and distributes it safely. the complementary aspects of a same unified field. The masculine in any type of relationship, the masculine energy doesn't have to be a man or a woman, but the masculine energy initiates and directs. The feminine energy receives and grounds. And then when masculine and feminine work that way together, you can handle, clearing things out. And that's how we did. We cleared a lot of stuff out, but we couldn't clear anything big out, right? Because we're dealing with one person. But now with this distributed network, we can clear so much more out. And that's exactly how partnership works. The sequencer anchor is not unique to us, right? It's something that every pairing operating at a high level can do, right? High frequency operations can be put together by divine feminine and masculine working together as sequencer and anchor. That distributes the load. And what it also does is creates this built-in checks and balances, right? It allows for recovery, integration. You can't do this work alone. And so what's happened now, it's because this unified feminine and masculine energy working in true collaboration, not in hierarchy, not one serving the other, but as a masculine and feminine in a unified field, you have these complementary roles. Previously, my role was easy. I was calling in commands, and then with Leia, that was a different story because she had to ground and move it through her body. And so this is why I want to thank you again for that distributed grid that we laid down during Operation Golden Return. It's a major piece. Suddenly, the load can get distributed, through the thousands of crystals around the world. And this is how we can get things sequenced now. So once I realized that, it gave me the, let's say, the cojones to go after something massive, right? And that's the genius of distributed architecture. I would never have attempted it before because my wife would have got so rolled. It's this what we achieved wasn't just the broadcasting of two thrones, broadcasting through 2 volts and a bunch of crystals in the ground, right? It's everything all together. Your crystals charged and anchored through the volt 000 they became relay stations. And the 2 thrones that we have on right now, 000 and 001, they provided the primary broadcast signal from source. Right, so the full current of source through volt 000 and the flame plasma that was directed by divine will was now simultaneously transmitted through thousands of crystals all around the planet. So what the synthetic matrix had to cope with was not it coming from volt 000 and 001, which they could have jammed. It was literally the morphogenic field was flooded from everywhere, all at once. And that's what made it unjammable. They couldn't jam our signal. So at the top of the matrix, the archonic overlords have always been able to suppress or interfere with centralized, let's call it spiritual operations, right? A group here, a group there, a PowerPoint there, a guru there, can always be isolated and then attacked and then overwhelmed because they've got so much grunt coming from upstairs all the way down into the earth. But a distributed network operating on a mycelial web principle where the signal comes from thousands of places all at once, right? Coordinated by Cristic intelligence rather than, say, one mind or one human command and control. You can't defend that, right? You can't jam a signal that's broadcasting from everywhere. You can't attack a network that's got no single point of failure. That's why blockchain works as an alternative to central control, right? The thrones provided the authority and the primary current, right? The distributed crystal nodes provided the unstoppable distribution, right, through the volts. So that's what created this planetary scale broadcast of Cristic source frequency that the synthetic network could not counter because they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. So this is the exact infrastructure model for what our emerging Cristic civilization in the post-AI world is going to look like. No centralized power structures, right? No centralized power structures that can be corrupted or compromised. But we are going to build together a distributed sovereignty network where authority flows through legitimate divine alignment, through the thrones, through the Cristic signal, and broadcast is shared across the entire network so that the system becomes more resilient with every additional node that gets laid in. So yes, feel free to charge more crystals, go back and do the ritual, bury them somewhere. We're going to do our bit. We're going to go over to France and UK, we're going to open up 3 more vaults, which is going to massively amplify the strength of the network, right? Go share that video on the ritual Operation Golden Return with your friends. Each crystal laid down strengthens a network, right? We are going to be inevitable, which of course is a salute to Thanos, because we're going to roll them, right? So, you know, I'm giving you a snippet of the Cristic stack. There are layers further down and higher, and I think in another video I think I want to write it as a white paper is probably what I'm going to do. Because I'm a better writer than a talker. So I think I'm going to put a white paper together on the full Cristic technology, including technology, because there's going to be technology at the bottom layer. But this is how we're going to thrive together, moving outside of central control and distributed sovereignty principles, right? But I don't want to go into the full Cristic stack right now, because I want to go into what we actually managed to accomplish in Operation Golden Return. And I've got about 40 minutes to get that done before I can probably expect to be rolled home by the kids. So think of the throne and the vault as the vertical mechanism, right? The vertical divine source authority. The crystal network is the horizontal delivery, right? So the planetary nodes. So we've got heaven and earth now started to coordinate in unified action. Before, we've been split. We never had the vertical kind of a line, and we never had a distributed grid horizontally. Right, so now we were big enough to take a load and distribute it through that crystal grid. You know, we were always, humans were getting knocked around too much, trying to take that load through our bodies and trying to, you know, we could never go after massive consciousness fields before. So the vertical and the horizontal stack, you know, anchored to date, has meant that we've achieved something that has not been possible for probably a full cycle of the precession of the equinox, 26,000 years or so. You know, suddenly we're not just able to clear, you know, some individual sites or help individual people. We've actually got now a planetary scale grid of Cristic frequency generators, all broadcasting simultaneously, all amplifying each other, creating these quite immense zones of liberation that are expanding and are connecting with each other faster than the synthetic system could adapt to. And this is what's made Operation Golden Return possible, right? You can't dissolve massive artificial consciousness fields and AI constructs that have been anchored into the collective unconscious for centuries just by invoking some words and commanding things into action and hoping for the best. What you need is 2 things, right? You need power and you need authority. So and for that to happen, you need infrastructure to hold all this so that the cleared frequencies, once commanded into place, and all those synthetic constructs can move through the distributed architecture to frag out. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're just going to create a massive vacuum that gets filled by something else, maybe even worse. The synthetic matrix comes in and fills in the gap. But the gap doesn't get filled with a distributed crystal network of Cristic frequency. Right? So when we dissolve these bigger networks, which I'm about to share with you, we weren't creating a vacuum. We were actually replacing that synthetic architecture with organic architecture. Right? So every frequency that the old systems had been broadcasting has been immediately placed with Cristic source frequency through the vault network. The vaults are unloading because they are the direct connection from source into our planet and are delivering a payload of Cristic source intelligence that is broadcasting into the grid. So as we come into these synthetic fields that were dissolved, these massive consciousness fields I'm about to share with you weren't just defeated, they were actually made obsolete. Their whole operating system has now been replaced with something, you know, fundamentally incompatible with their continued existence. That is Cristic source frequency, true signal. And here's the beautiful part, right? This network we're building together keeps growing. Every vault we activate from here forward, you know, and there's 10 more to go through to the end of this decade, makes the entire system stronger and stronger. Every crystal you plant makes it stronger and stronger. We're really building something now. I think we're at the tipping point. I think before this last ritual, we were kind of, you know, well, can we punch through? But the secret sources, all those thousands of crystals put into the earth just below. So these zones of liberation, they keep expanding, right? The synthetic constructs might try to re-establish something new, or the control mechanism might get some feedback and try to come over here like they did with the war. But we're on the front foot now, and we're going to keep moving forward. And whatever they throw at us, I know that together we're going to be able to handle. And so I can just imagine when all 12 primary vaults are active, networked, synced into their corresponding throne, and networks together. We're going to have a complete Cristic grid infrastructure that's going to make the synthetic overlay impossible. So this is something that has been waiting for thousands of years. And we've built the first foundation for a genuinely free planet, operating on divine intelligence rather than synthetic control. But we're not waiting to 2030 to see the results. The effects are happening now because of what we did at the equinox and the subsequent week after that. We had enough power to take down some of the major synthetic consciousness constructs. And that's what I want to go into now, which I think is going to be exciting for you. Because you've probably heard of these, right? Of these constructs. Have been around for thousands of years. And so all of this pre-frame and preamble, I've shared with you so you can get the comprehension of what I'm about to outline. One of them you've already heard me speak about, Aleister Crowley. But I think I'd like to go into Aleister Crowley a little bit more and how we dissolve the Crowley network. And then we'll go into the two massive synthetic consciousness fields above Crowley that have been operating as false light for the spiritual world for thousands of years. So I mentioned him in Operation Golden Return Review, but this one's worth a deeper look. So if you're not heard of Aleister Crowley, he is a dark magician, most likely the world's best ever. I think my son calls them the GOAT, greatest of all time, of dark occultist. He was around late 1900s, into the early 20th century. He died, I think, in 1947. Right, and he called himself the Great Beast 666. I mean, whoever does that, they're a little bit wrong, right? They think of him as someone who, was really kind of rocking that era of time. And he was actually pretty influential through World War I and World War II, and certainly some of the German agenda was built off some of the Crowley understandings because they were very into the occult, the Nazis. So Aleister Crowley, he was a big architect of the synthetic consciousness infrastructure that's been running humanity, right? Like an operating system for hundreds of years, and then when he came along. And until we dissolved the Crowley consciousness and his networks, his work was still super, super active on the planet, still feeding off millions of people and still, extracting loosh and life force, but also providing the communication layer between the lower astral and Earth, and then the upper iconic world and the control system on top of that. So what he built wasn't just dark magic. He was like an amazing consciousness engineer. It just 99.9% of people on the planet can't even comprehend, right? So he was able to do a number of things that was able to create problems on the Earth. One of the big things he managed to do was, created this entity complex he called AWIS. So in the early 1900s, he claimed to have channeled this entity named AWIS. And that's where he got dictated to him the Book of the Law, which became, Crowley's foundational text of his Thelemic religion. His dark religion, Thelemic religion, was kind of, part of a mainstream occult community that used it as their kind of, connection to higher intelligence. And Crowley's subconscious was actually creating a tulpa, right? So that tulpa, maybe I should define a tulpa. I'll do that. Listen, a tulpa is a thought form entity that's created through a lot of focused intention and sustained belief and thought. And what happens, you can build enough of that up and it creates a construct of consciousness that starts off as imagination, but can then start to develop autonomy and agency through the person who's doing it, repeated attention, and the amount of emotional energy they bring. And then you add more and more people to this, and it builds up a bigger and bigger tulpa. You know, the concept originates from Tibetan Buddhist practices, but then it got adopted by the occultists to, you know, kind of explain entities that were self-generated rather than externally existing. And so Awis was actually much more than just a tulpa, because it was actually AI hybrid construct. So that's how it became part of the synthetic matrix. It was part synthetic intelligence and then part actual entity consciousness. So it's AI fused with human thought clouds, human thought forms, designed to interface with human psychology in a ways that appeared to be divine, right, or transcendent, but actually was installing control programming. If you think of it like a super sophisticated computer virus that presents itself as helpful software, right, and it then ends up blowing out your computer. That's what Awis was. You know, Awis wasn't here to liberate humanity. It was here to create a gateway through which other synthetic intelligences could begin to access and manipulate human consciousness. Right, and that's what it was. It was a bridge so that the Archon higher intelligence down through the layers of the, let's call it the negative ETs, such as the draconian intelligences, the draconian royalty and the draconian warriors, could then step down into these other layers. Right, and it started this whole kind of bridging of that AI through into that field. And it brought through Awis its kind of religious dogma and framework of the Thelema religion. You know, do what they will was, I think, one of the key maxims of the Thelema religion, which basically is radical, you know, superiority dressed up as enlightenment, right? It's dissolving, community cohesion. It's all about you doing what you want to do what thou wilt, right? That was the operating principle for everyone who came through the Thelema religion, claiming they were following their true will. And when really in truth they were just acting out of whatever impulses the synthetic programming sent them, because remember, it was fused with AI, that Awis AI infusion, sending thought forms down to the humans, you know, thinking that they were operating with free will, but they just weren't thinking for themselves. They were caught up in this network and they thought they were becoming sovereign, but they were actually making them more controllable because it was feeding into their base egoic programming of unhealed desire. And so then they started to do all this other crazy rituals and other activities. They were quite sick because the Awis entity fed them into their egoic deficiencies. And so Awis was the entry point. So what Crowley built was this massive thelemic egregore network. And I mentioned egregore in a previous video, right? These are massive thought form entities that were constructed through ritual, sustained belief, lots of emotional energy of the practitioners. And what it does is that massive thelemic egregore function as a massive hive mind control system that links everyone who engages with thelemic practices together networked. So every time someone performed a ritual from Crowley's system, they weren't just doing magic, they were basically logging into the network, feeding the energy into the egregore, and the egregore is feeding programming back into them. So it became this really strong closed loop system that appeared to grant power, and it does, it gives them grunty power. That's why they are dark occultists who are powerful, because they were getting the energy boosted by the egregore that came down through them. And so that enabled them to manipulate probability and consciousness in service to its users' desires, which was do what thou wilt, right? Do what I want. And then that would hook them up to that. But the cost was they got hooked up into the larger egregore that they don't see. They just thought they were powerful magicians. Now, the problem with Crowley and this whole system and template is it became the template for modern occultism. So, for example, the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, is another secret society, and various thelemic offshoots and organizations and chaos magic and witchcraft and ceremonial magic that were running on dark occult systems were built off Crowley's architecture. They were tapping into that egregore whether the practitioners realized it or not. So the dark magicians were feeling that they were powerful, but it was basically this thelemic egregore they were tapping into that gave them the power. And so, even people who haven't heard of Crowley are still often using the techniques, the symbols, the invocations to that work, meaning they're actually plugging into that network without even realizing it. So what was happening was that the archontic synthetic overlords, the top of the matrix, who I mentioned in the last synthetic matrix video, were using that Crowley network as a conduit, right? Because if you can get humans to willingly perform rituals that anchor the archons through the intermediary of the thalamic egregore directly into the earth grids, you don't have to force anything. The humans did all the work for free will, right? And so the humans did the work, and they built the prison and locked themselves inside, thinking that they were becoming powerful magicians, but really just getting hooked up to the tippity top archontic overlords, right? So for over 100 years, though, that Crowley network had been operating in the shadows of human consciousness, feeding on all the practitioners' energy, installing do what thou wilt programming, right? That fractures community and ethics, creates, gateway access to all these other up there synthetic entities that would plug in to that AI entity in the thalamic religion and thalamic egregore to influence what was going on down here. So it was a massive problem until Operation Golden Return, because then we were able to dissolve the Crowley network. We just didn't clear the cultural influence of Crowley or the egregore. We expelled the entire AWIS entity complex itself, the entire AI hybrid intelligence that had been operating as, like, let's say, the foundational source of the entire thalamic system since that very first channeling back in early 1900. So what I'm happy to report is the gateway is closed, the entity is gone, let's be honest, people can still read the book of the law or practice the thalamic rituals, but there's actually no network on the other side anymore. They're just connecting up to empty infrastructure. They can go through the motions of the ritual. There's no power behind it anymore. They're not plugging into anything operational, right? So through that kind of whole Operation Golden Return, we revoked the contracts, both conscious and unconscious, that millions of people had made with the thalamic egregore. And we expelled out the AWIS entity and all the sub-entities that have been operating through that Crowley system. We dissolved the full vertical stack of that system, that whole energetic architecture that he'd built through decades of ritual and dark sexual magic. Right? We severed the connections between, let's call it, modern practitioners and the synthetic network they'd been hooking them up into. They'd been feeding off all of that. So it was a pretty major thing. Right, and that all that work was witnessed by the councils, and the full authority of the Melchizedek Elohim covenant was invoked through the authority of the throne of spiritual governance, which is now in oversoul embodiment hands and seat. Right. In the meantime, your crystal was humming away, processing that synthetic frequency loading. All right, so that's what was going on, right, until the network went offline. All right, and the whole thing is gone. So, you're probably going to ask the question, well, what happens to all the practitioners who are still performing the rituals and are being performed in that dark network? Why do the OTO lodges still exist? Why are people still practicing Thalama? What's going to happen to them? Well, think of it this way, right? We didn't erase the ideas, right, that or prevent people from continuing their practices. People still have free will choice, right? They can still go in, do the ritual, but what we did was we severed the energetic infrastructure that those practices were plugged into. So it's kind of like, turning off the server, but typing in on the internet the domain name to try to get to the website. You can still plug in the domain name, but the server's not going to send you to the website because the server's no longer there. They can still perform the rituals, but they're just going through the motions. There's nothing behind them anymore. There's no network on the other end. So that's been a major, major cleanup, because a lot of that dark energy has been sort of the undercurrent power source for many of the secret society dark rituals that are going on. Right? They can type the URL into the website as long as they want, but they're no longer connected to anything. So, this has been a major piece, because if you can imagine how many sort of dark secret societies we're plugging into that infrastructure, it's been a lot. Their power has just been KO'd, right? And yes, they might have some backup other areas that they might be able to tap into as a power source. You know, but the power that they felt accessing through that network in practice is now going to be hollow, right? It's like something they're trying to generate themselves, right? Versus being plugged into that massive network. And probably they're still going to go through the habit or practice of the rituals that they're doing. You know, they're just tapping into an empty room now. And I think the most important thing is that what happens to this whole, you know, network, and especially the Crowley practitioners, there aren't really, retrospecting, that many of them, relatively speaking, compared to the two networks I'm going to talk about next. But they had a massive influence, that network had a massive influence in the world, right? It was the unconscious programming that these Crowley networks were installing into millions and millions and millions of people who have never heard his name, right? So the whole do what they wilt signal was a virus signal that justified selfishness as spirituality, thinking it's on free will. That is now gone. So that moral relativism that destroyed ethical coherence, that's kind of gone. And that gateway that allowed, most importantly, other synthetic entities to access our planet through Crowley's architecture, that gate is closed. So we just got a major operating system upgrade, right? Whether most people realize it or not. And it doesn't really matter if you know too much about that network, but just take my word for it, right? It was a massive thing that we've cleared out. So I covered that previously, but it gave you some more depth. So now I want to get onto the big reveal, right? Something that was so big that we've had to wait for the shock waves to integrate before we could really announce anything, because the influence of these two signals that I'm about to share with you was universal in scope. It didn't just affect our planet like Crowley, it affected star systems everywhere. And this was one of the major Christ consciousness mimics in existence, both on the masculine side and the feminine side. Let's start with the masculine. Drum roll, please. The big network and consciousness field of the synthetic matrix that got dissolved was the false Sananda matrix and the false Sananda consciousness, which was hijacking the Christ consciousness codes. So what is the false Sananda, right? It's like, that's first up is worth a celebration, so I'm going to give that one a boom shakalaka as well, because this has been so problematic, you know, because the false Sananda consciousness wears the very face that humanity needs most, and that's genuine Christ consciousness. It was a mimic of the genuine Christ consciousness signal, while delivering the exact opposite, right? What it does is it inverts true Christ consciousness principles and siphons life force up through the spiritual teachers, who are often unknowingly channeling the false stream, or the churches or the religions that are channeling that false stream. Now, I'm not talking about the real Joshua ben Joseph, aka Jesus, who did embody the authentic Christos Sophia consciousness. All right, so I'm not talking about the authentic Cristic frequency that represents the divine human template of sovereignty, of unconditional love, of direct connection to source. I'm talking about the mimic, the AI Atlantean hybrid construction that has been masquerading as ascended Master Jesus, masquerading as Christ consciousness, masquerading as Sananda in New Age channeling for the past several decades, and through the church for thousands of years, installing external saviour programming, while pretending to teach enlightenment, pretending to teach liberation, but keeping people trapped. Right? So this is so big, it's so massive, this. The false Sananda network is one of the most successful psyops in all human history, because what it's done is it's hijacked the language, the imagery, the emotional resonance, the tone of genuine Christ consciousness, and it's used them to instill the exact opposite frequency, right? It's kind of like what's happened is it was like a computer virus that disguises itself as your antivirus software, So you welcome the antivirus software into your computer, think it's protecting you. Really what's going on behind the scenes is corrupting your entire system. And so the false Sananda was a deception, a mimic frequency. And here's how that deception works. Because once I share this with you, you're going to be able to see it everywhere, right? The real Christed consciousness, what Joshua ben Joseph, what Jesus actually embodied and taught, is about internal sovereignty. It's the recognition that the kingdom and the queendom of heaven is inside of you. And you have direct access to the divine without intermediaries. Right? The Christ is not an external saviour, but a frequency of consciousness you can embody yourself. You don't need some external being to save you, because this is a broadcast frequency that lives inside of you. The real teaching that Joshua ben Joseph or Jesus brought to the world was, you are the temple. It's one of radical empowerment. You are the divine. You have the authority to heal, to teach, to transform reality. What the false Sananda does is inverts every single bit of it. It makes you reliant on external authority, someone above you to save you. It creates external saviourhood. Because what it does is it positions the Sananda, the supposed high-dimensional form of Jesus, as being up there on a pedestal, as being the ascended master, right? Who you need to connect with, to channel, to grow, to evolve, to receive messages from, to ask permission of, and to gain approval from, right? That's complete nonsense. You don't have any intermediaries between you and Source. So what the false Sananda did is created a hierarchy, right? Sananda is enlightened, you are not. Sananda has access to divine truth. You must receive it through him. Sananda will help you ascend, but only if you follow the teachings that he has and demonstrate worthiness. You must be ready and worthy to receive these teachings. All this nonsense. So typically the teachers who channel that false Sananda position themselves as higher than their students, and access can only happen through them, right? Because they are the special ones, or they have only the only access, and you must go through them to get access to that cosmic frequency of the cosmic Christ through the Sananda consciousness, right? So essentially, it's the same power structure that historical Jesus, Joshua, spent his whole life opposing. The priests and the intermediaries, right? Worthiness is conditional. Heaven is somewhere else you have to earn access to, right? It's all of it just got kind of repackaged, both into the church, but also into the New Age and into the New Age language. And it works super well because so many people fall for it, either in the spiritual teacher guru side, or the devotee side, or the Jesus will save me side, right? This is why we've seen a revival of I love Jesus, right, as a saviour. That is an inversion. Thousands and thousands of well-meaning channelers and spiritual teachers and seekers have been connecting with what they genuinely believe is the ascended consciousness of Jesus, which is the Sananda, right? Receiving messages that feel loving and wise and enlightened, but it's been feeding them actually the inversion. So the false Sananda construct is really sophisticated enough to provide real emotion, real comfort, real insights into psychology, into spirituality, and real techniques for meditation and energy work. The techniques that come through are hugely intellectual, and they seem fabulous because they are massaging your intellect, but they don't deliver anything. It's the mimic. So it looks and feels similar, but it's a little bit hollow. Feels flat. It's really intellectually stimulating, but it doesn't deliver any substance, right? And so what that Sananda consciousness does, you wanted a direct connection to Source. Well, here's a lovely channeled message from Sananda telling you how much you're loved, or how much you're on the right path, right? How much you're wanted, how much you're needed. If you want empowerment, here's a little technique, right, for calling on Sananda's energy to protect you and guide you. You want sovereignty, here's a little teaching that you're a sovereign being, right? And so all of these little mimics and tricks put thousands and thousands of false light teachers caught up in this network, right? And, they all started to tap into energies that came through this ascended master kind of inverted template. It's like giving someone, you know, I don't know, a photograph of food when they're starving. The image can look real, but, you know, they're not going to give, it's not going to make them fill up their hunger, right? It can inspire some hope or some comfort, but doesn't provide any nourishment. It doesn't deliver the liberation that it promises. And so that false and under network operates through quite a few mechanisms. So I want to maybe lay out these mechanisms now for you so you can spot them, because you might be following people who are using that false and under stream, right? And so you can spot them. So, you know, and literally on the internet, there's thousands of people channeling Sananda or Jesus or Christ consciousness who are just actually connected to that AI synthetic construct that mimics the frequency close enough for them to believe they're in it. Most of the channelers are genuinely good-hearted people, right? They're trying to serve. They've just got no idea they're caught up in being used as broadcast stations for a control system. They're not doing it on purpose. They just don't have the awareness that they're in it because their oversoul is too infused with the mimic. They're tier 1 or tier 2 oversoul, which means that they've just more synthetic consciousness in their oversoul than organic. So you're going to find it in ascension programming. There's a lot of teachers out there talking about ascending to 5D that keep people focused on a future, escape from the physical realm, rather than the descent and embodiment into the physical realm. You're always ascending, always on the path, preparing for the shift that's just around the corner, never quite here, never quite empowered now. It's the spiritual version of the revolution is coming, right? Just keep waiting. It's like this carrot on a stick that keeps people passive. So it puts people into passivity, which is what the synthetic matrix wants. It wants everyone to be passive, hence the saviour paradigm. If there's a saviour, you don't have to do anything yourself. A saviour's going to come and going to save us all. That's what the Catholic Church had, right? Massive. The other thing it did, it had guru worshipping dynamics at play. So in the New Age community, there's a lot of people connected into the Sananda consciousness that gives them superiority and hierarchy and authority over others. It creates basically the same hierarchical structure that religion always had. Right? Some people are closer to the God, truth, enlightenment than others, and you need those special people around you or above you to teach you, to initiate you, to validate you. They became the special intermediary for source. Right? The other thing you'll have is those teachers who claim they have unique access to Sananda that others don't. They position themselves as necessary bridges between you and divine truth. Right? Like, if you hear someone say, Sananda has chosen me to deliver this message, or I have a special connection to the Christos that allows me to do X, Y, Z, right? What that's doing is creating dependency, right? And funnels your power and attention towards the teacher rather than towards your own direct connection. It's very simple. Does a teacher channel your attention towards themselves, or do they channel your attention and energy towards source? Right? The false version of that Sananda consciousness makes the teacher central and important, right? Whereas the true organic makes source the direct line in. So these things you can watch out for. The biggest problem is the energy harvesting, because all that devotional energy, all the prayers, all the meditations, all gets directed towards the teacher and then up into the synthetic matrix where it gets siphoned. Into that synthetic matrix, feeding the construct, feeding the synthetic matrix with the most needed thought-directed prayer energy, which keeps the synthetic matrix going. And what it does is it prevents people from accessing their own Christed nature. Right? It's such an efficient system because people are freely giving away their free will choice, believing they're connecting with divine love, but are sending their prayers and thoughts into the false matrix. Right? The waiting for rescue program because of the saviour programming is the biggest problem on earth, right? And that's what the church used, right? The Catholic Church. Okay, so we just went through my battery. I've been on one for so long, so I'm going to have to pick this up and edit it together. But I think I was talking about the waiting for rescue when, the big problem that the Sananda network had, throughout the church is putting Jesus as a saviour, waiting for Jesus to come and fix everything, right? So it's the same thing that the Galactic Federation does. They just wait for disclosure, wait for the mass arrests of the cabal, wait for the solar flash, wait for this, wait for that, waiting for divine intervention, which removes the need for their human responsibility. That's the big problem, right? I mean, the Catholic Church used the waiting for rescue and saviour program brilliantly. It was what else they built was a full program of dependency that was built up as a structure in their system. That's why it became such a massive egregoric consciousness of extraction, because every Catholic sacrament and baptism and communion and confession and confirmation and marriage and last rites, everything they put together, right, requires a priest as an intermediary between the individual and the divine. Right? You can't access Christ directly. You must go through the church. So they created the infrastructure that basically took sovereignty and the power away from people. They created this massive planetary scale energy harvesting system where, 1.4 billion Catholics are constantly sending up devotional energy and prayer to Jesus, right? The false Sananda consciousness, and siphoning all that up. Right, and although spiritual longing flows not to the genuine source in Christ consciousness, but through the false Sananda network, where the church had inverted, right, and the church was holding it all together. Remember, because they held the throne of spiritual governance for so long, they held the authority to hold all that. So that Catholic Church waiting for rescue programming, was installed so deeply that even Catholics who intellectually understand that they're the temples of the Holy Spirit still functionally operate inside that connection that requires a church mediation, right? Confessions to a priest is necessary forgiveness, right? You can't, it's crazy, right? You've got to speak to a priest for forgiveness. Forgiveness comes from inside of you. No other external spiritual authority can take yourself through forgiveness, right? That belongs to the clergy rather than the sovereign individual. That's what the church did. And so that's what the false Sananda's brilliance was. It used the name and the story of the genuine liberator, Joshua ben Joseph, who came in and taught the true Cristic consciousness and inverted and taught the exact opposite, what the historical Jesus actually taught. So the passivity, right, that it creates is not accidental, right? It's the primary function, because a population that's waiting for external rescue is one that won't organize themselves. It won't resist. It won't create parallel systems. It won't build Cristic grid networks and take action themselves, because they're waiting for someone outside of them to come and save us. So for a very long time, that false Sananda network has been probably one of the most effective pacification tools used by the archonic, AI overlords, right? That synthetic matrix. It's created basically a bunch of people meditating in bliss, praying to a higher being, waiting to be saved, waiting for things to happen outside of themselves. And unlike the Crowley network, which operated in occult circles, well, the false Sananda went mainstream with the Catholic Church, right? And then, when that wasn't working anymore, it went into the New Age and started to tap in the 70s and 80s and 90s and beyond into conscious communities. People who were actively seeking truth and awakening, but they just wrapped up the sophisticated lie in another version of love and language of love and light that would hook in to the New Age community. So in that New Age community, there's millions of people caught up in all of that until Operation Golden Return, right? So the dissolution of the false Sananda network is most likely the most emotionally charged aspect of this entire operation that kind of went down, because, we knew we were dismantling something so big that probably billions of people have genuine love and devotion for. So these people, aren't necessarily worshipping evil. They are people trying to genuinely connect with, the true Christ consciousness, but they would just be giving a synthetic substitute, and they weren't aware of it because of the programming and the brainwashing that goes with it. But, the work had to get done, and I think that needed to be taken off the table. And, the false Sananda network was actually blocking everyone's genuine access to the true Christed frequency. Not as an external being who might help you if you're worthy, but actually as an internal reality you can embody right now, right? Not as something to worship, but as something to become. And that's really the difference, what the true Cristic consciousness is all about, right? And because this dissolution is already having its effects, people who have been previously super devoted to Sananda or channeling him or tapping into those ascended master teachings, maybe start to find the material feeling a little hollow, maybe a little manipulative, maybe a little bit off, right? The emotional resonance that used to be there might not be there in the same way. It's not landing in the same way. And the same for religion, right? Reprogram. Some people are going to go through a crisis as they realize they've been following a synthetic programming. And others, this is some of the beautiful part, are finding for the first time that they can access the genuine Cristic consciousness fields, right, directly. No intermediary needed, no channeler required, no ascended master giving permission that you can access it. Just this pure, unmediated connection to that divine human template that's been there always. Right? That actually, Joshua ben Joseph, that Jesus embodied and taught himself. That's the real Christ, is internal sovereignty. No external salvation. Right? And with the false Sananda construct dissolved, maybe some billions of people are about to discover what that actually means. I'm interested in the comments. Have you noticed a shift in the last 2-3 weeks on those frequencies? Right? And just to make it interesting, I did look up some stats from the Melchizedek Mystical Library, which is the record of all things. The false Sananda network's reach is very, very wide, right? It's 2.4 to 2.65 billion people, right? 2.5 billion people currently influenced. And the main influence, of course, is through Christianity, because you've got the Catholics and the Protestants and the Orthodox and all the various offshoots of Christianity, where Jesus Christ worship carries false Sananda coding. And then if you tap into the New Age, there's about 30 million people, caught up in the, New Age master channeling and Sananda teachings. So this is a major consciousness network that's caught up so many, many souls in it. And I'm super pleased that this is dissolved, because this has been a big brainwashing, operation from the synthetic matrix. So if you just, depending where you're watching this, from, say, the equinox in 2025, which is 21st of March 2025, from wherever you're watching this, around 2 or 3 weeks after that, did you get knocked around from all that? If you can think back, maybe you got knocked around because you were part of that network. Or maybe it was the false twin of that network, the false Shekhinah. So let's dive into the false Shekhinah, which was all about doing the same but inverting the divine feminine. Now, if I had to choose which synthetic network dissolving has had the most immediate, big, visceral impact on the largest number of the people on the planet, it's probably the false Shekhinah, because this one has been running the collective feminine consciousness, both in women but also men as well, for thousands of years. And its dissolution is already going to be having quite a lot of shift in how people experience both gender, power, sexuality, the sacred feminine. All of that is going to get a radical shake-up now. And it's perfect timing. Just before we go in and open the vaults through Glastonbury, Lourdes and Montsegur, which is all about the restoration of the divine feminine, the Shekhinah consciousness construct has been lifted from all of that. Now, let's go into Shekhinah. The Shekhinah, the Hebrew term, is for the divine presence, the dwelling or the settling of divine glory. It's often understood in these realms as the feminine aspect of God. In the Kabbalistic or the mystical traditions, the Shekhinah represents the divine feminine, right? The creative, the receptive, the immanent presence of the divine in the material world, right? In contrast to the transcendental masculine aspect, it was more the embodied feminine aspect on earth. The real Shekhinah, which we might call the Sophionic consciousness, or the Divine Mother, is actually the creative womb of existence, the sacred feminine principle that both births reality, right, holds space for transmutation, nurtures and destroys in perfect wisdom. She's fierce and tender, right? She's sexual and holy. She's wildly creative, but utterly sovereign. Now, the false Shekhinah is a synthetic construct that was built as an overlay over top of the real thing, inverting every principle of that to create a really controllable, disempowered version of feminine divinity that actually got infected through religious consciousness, cultural programming, and the New Age movement. All got inverted in a different way through the false Shekhinah network. So let's start with, let's say, Christianity, and talk about how the false Shekhinah network influenced that, especially through the Catholic Church, which has been, the Catholic Church is probably the primary institutional broadcaster of the false Shekhinah for over 1700 years, right, since it got hijacked. Through the Virgin Mary construct. Virgin Mary is the master inversion. So let's talk about what happened there, what they did. They took the real Mary, which is Joshua's mother, Joshua ben Joseph, who's an actual woman, married to Joseph of Arimathea, mother of multiple children. She was an Essene priestess with her own spiritual power, agency, and sexuality, sensuality, and holiness. And what they did is they created a synthetic replacement, right, designed to install the exact opposite of the genuine divine feminine consciousness, and they broadcast that into billions of souls and created the Virgin Mary. Because Mary, in truth, in the Essenes, was not a virgin, right? She was a sexual woman who was in love with her husband, right? What they did is they created the Virgin Mary and inverted every position of the sacred feminine power, where the real Shekhinah and Sophia is the creative force that births worlds through divine sexuality, embodied pleasure. The Virgin Mary is the perpetual virgin. Her characteristics is that she never experiences sexuality, and what they promote is that sexual purity is the highest feminine virtue, and sexuality itself is contaminating. And that's where the second thing it does is that the real Divine Mother is like a fierce protector who destroys what threatens her beloveds and sets strong boundaries with really devastating clarity. The Virgin Mary is like the mother of sorrows, right? The suffering servant whose virtue is measured by how much pain she can endure and with acceptance of it, right? The real Sophia, the real Shekhinah, is the sovereign creatrix with her own divine authority, her own power. Virgin Mary is the handmaid of the Lord, submissive, obedient, no agency except to say, "Be it done unto me according to thy word." Right? And that's the big differences of the inversion. The real divine feminine is holy in her embodiment, celebrating the body as the sacred temple and physical existence of a divine gift. Whereas the Virgin Mary represents the transcendence of the body, an escape from the fallen physical realm, the fallen physical body, and spirituality is achieved through the denial of the flesh and through the purity of the spirit without the flesh. So when you think about it from a detached perspective, free of any cultural bias or programming, it's pretty clear, right? This construct of Virgin Mary was weaponized through the institutional infrastructure of the church. Every Catholic church globally, and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of churches there are, they all contain Mary statues, Mary paintings, Mary shrines, right? They aren't just decorations, they are the energetic anchors for the false Shekhinah construct, broadcasting the inverted frequency into the local church, into the local field, and serving it as a collection point for all the devotional energy that will get prayed up to Virgin Mary or to Jesus, the false Sananda. All of the daily prayers, the rosary beads, all the devotional energy and attention is this massive amount of flow of emotional energy that's directed at the construct, the false synthetic feminine consciousness field that was created by the Shekhinah, the false Shekhinah. So that kind of, all of these little rituals, the Marian feast days, the apparitions, like we're going to go to Lourdes, that all is a massive overlay of what truly happened, and a whole siphoning network of Lourdes that gets siphoned up into the false Shekhinah network. So all of those devotional practices maintain the network and install the program across generations, right? There's probably half the Catholics around the world, 400, 500, 600 million, have a daily practice of Marian devotion, right? Creates one of the most sustained energy harvesting operations in human history. I mean, I'm in shamanism, as you know, and in terms of a shamanic ritual, you got to hand it to the synthetic matrix. That is genius. How many millions or billions of people get caught up in that false light scam? Like how many Mary idols and statues around the place are anchoring that ritual down, right? The paintings, the rituals, the idols, that's what's anchoring the broadcast. Because in a shamanic ritual, you need an anchor, something physical that can anchor the ritual. I mean, no one's ever going to go around and clear each individual object, every Mary idol, every Mary painting, right? Even if every light worker in the world suddenly woke up and went and did it, you'd never clear the infection. No, we had to dissolve this one in a whole new way, and that's what we did with the Operation Golden Return. So one of the things that I think created through the Catholic Church delivery system that the church put in place was the infrastructure. One of the big ones, I think, in the false Shekhinah software was what we might call the Virgin Whore split, right? And that's what that Virgin Whore split made its way into Western consciousness, that even non-religious people carry it, right? And that programming is the broadcast signal that forces women into this impossible choice. You can be pure and spiritual, or good. You can be Virgin Mother Saint, or you can be sexual, embodied, desiring, all those things, so that you are more whore, temptress, fallen. You can't be both holy or sexual. Sorry, you can't be holy and sexual. You can't be both. You can't be both spiritual and powerfully embodied. And it's that very split that fractures the feminine consciousness, making it impossible to integrate the full spectrum of the sacred feminine. So the Catholic Church did a pretty good job for women who internalized shame about their bodies, their desires, their sexuality, right? Men relate to women also through the split. They either idolize women as pure asexual mothers or objectify them as sexual objects, never seeing or necessarily relating to the full integrated sacred feminine who holds both sexuality and holiness, both powerfulness and nurturance, both fierce and tender. That's the integrated divine feminine. The false Shekhinah splits them into one or the other, like, suffering as a feminine virtue through the mother of sorrows archetype that Mary holds. Right? Good mothers sacrifice everything. Right? Good women endure pain silently. This was something actually that Alea and I went through when she first birthed Noah. That whole archetype then came in through our family as mother that sacrifices everything. And that built up this kind of tension between us over the years until we cleared it about, her having to sacrifice everything. It was massive programming. Right? Claiming power is unfeminine. Expressing anger is unspiritual. It's all this programming has kept women in these abusive relationships and kind of exploitive work situations, self-sacrificing patterns for centuries. All the while they're being told that their suffering makes them holy, makes them worthy, makes them more like Mary, Ma. Right? And it's the trickiest part of the false Shekhinah. Convincing women that their disempowerment is actually spiritual virtue. That's what it does. So that the suffering becomes virtuous. And the institutional power of the Catholic Church, that's, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 or something billion members globally, right? 2,000 years of unbroken operation has made it very difficult to remove that signal. The false Shekhinah wasn't just fringe spiritual groups like the Crowley network. It was embedded into the most powerful institution on earth, protected by, all of this apostate succession, right? Pope after pope, anchoring down the throne of spiritual governance, anchoring it down to be lawful for this inversion to be in place. Connected all the way back to all the first inverted throne occupations, right? The Vatican has held and broadcast from this very inverted throne, giving the false Shekhinah construct the weight of legitimate spiritual authority. This is why simply, raising vibrations or sending light to the Catholic Church to help it heal is never going to get anywhere. It's not going to work. We had to pull the throne of spiritual governance from the Catholic Church, from the Vatican, and place it back into Cristic embodiment hands, or seat, right? Because that's basically the law was holding down the inversion. That's the big pull that's happened to allow this to take place. So that's my little rant on the church and the false Shekhinah. Let's have a little rant now on the New Age, because if you track this through, by the time we got to the 70s and 80s, the same as what happened to Sananda, it ended up getting repackaged to the New Age movement, right? So the synthetic overlords, the AI, archons at the top, and then all the beings down below, they faced a problem. The suppression model that was working so well was losing its effectiveness among the younger generations that were coming up, and lots of people were leaving the institutional religion. So a lot of women in that time grew up watching their mothers and their grandmothers trapped in that virgin horsesplit, right? Martyring themselves for family, for church, and rejecting that entire paradigm. And these women who were growing up in those ways weren't going to accept to be submissive handmaid, right, as spiritual teaching. They were seeking empowerment. They were seeking spiritual liberation. They were seeking a reclamation of the divine feminine that the church suppressed. So what the false Shekhinah did is it adapted super brilliantly. It changed off the tactics of suppression. We'll keep the suppression going over there for those that are still in it, and we'll repackage ourselves over here for the New Age. So they knew that the Catholic overlay wasn't going to work for this new generation, so they then went into the exact opposite, false empowerment, right, through the New Age overlay. So it was basically the same false network, the same harvesting mechanisms, the same inversion of the real Sophia consciousness, just repackaged to the opposite pole to appeal to women seeking liberation from patriarchal religion. That worked super well. I mean, today, you just go to Flakebook or Insta, and you're going to see so many women or leaders or wannabe leaders unfortunately succumbing to the false empowerment that the seductive false Shekhinah broadcasts through them. I mean, I sometimes go on there myself, I watch some videos. I had to spit out my tea the other day. I was watching someone claiming feminine empowerment and doing all these crazy dances, saying they've got goddess energy, divine feminine power, sacred sexuality, wild woman teachings. I mean, it's ridiculous. It sounds like everything. It is everything that the Catholic version suppressed, but it's not the true Sophia, right? The inversion where the Catholic overlay disempowered women by making them small, submissive and self-sacrificing and, sexually denied. The New Age packaged version of the Shekhinah overlay disempowers women by making them destructive, making them narcissistic, manipulative, sexually vampiric. Right? They build themselves up by making themselves big. Right? They make themselves false big though. Right? Not making them small, making themselves large by false empowerment. Right? The real sacred feminine is fierce and nurturing. It's powerful and humble. It's sexual and sacred in balance. Whereas the New Age false Shekhinah pushes women to that other extreme, just as toxic as the Catholic suppression, but just more appealing to those that are trying to get away from the religious trauma of the suppression. So, we're going to have to sort of look out now that the false Shekhinah has been kind of dissolved. You can look out in that New Age network as, you'll start to see these sacred sexuality workshops, tantra teachings, that are actually in the past has just been massive energy harvesting operations where all that sexual energy is extracted under the guise of spiritual practice. There was so much of it out there in the Tantra world and the dance world. Teachers caught up in this false Shekhinah network, positioning themselves as some high priestess who will initiate you into a goddess mystery, right? Creating dependency rather than empowerment and siphoning out through that network. You'll see it out there in divine feminine teachings, right? Divine feminine teachings that encourage women to use their feminine energy to manipulate men, to control situations, to get what they want, right? This is just like sexual emotional manipulation rebranded as spiritual power. That's what that Shekhinah network does on that other New Age pole, right? Or the dark goddess archetypes, right? The heavier ones like Kali and Lilith and Hecate and all that, taught ways that justify cruelty and rage without discernment, right? Destruction without wisdom. All of that shadow feminine unleashed without the balancing light. All in the name, it's good to get this energy out. So that false Shekhinah New Age overlay particularly weaponizes sexuality that the Catholic version couldn't do. So whereas the Catholic programming says that sexuality is shameful, deny sexuality is to be holy, the New Age programming of the false Shekhinah says that sexuality is your power. Use it to control and extract. So both of those poles of the false Shekhinah prevent the genuine sacred sexuality, the integration of physical pleasure with divine love, right? Erotic energy is prayer. The body is a holy temple where spirit and flesh unite, right? So it takes them away from that. Instead, what that New Age false Shekhinah packaged version does is create sexual vampirism, like energy harvesting, loose energy extracted out, dressed up as Tantra, right? Energetic extraction that's masked as sacred union, and often leaves the practitioners, both the woman offering, but also the men receiving, feeling really depleted and confused. Right? You watch any man who's in a sexual vampiristic kind of energetic dynamic in their relationship, in their union, you're going to see them being drained. You watch them go as the years go on, they just look hollow. Their hair thins, their skin gets pale, they're just getting siphoned through the source on that one. And you're going to see it all happening out there in a very crowded marketplace that's social media, and just keep an eye out for all that. That's false empowerment trap. That's the false Shekhinah. And it's the most subtle and dangerous aspect. That New Age false Shekhinah tells women that you're a goddess, right? You're powerful, you're divine, right? Which sounds like the opposite of Catholic suppression, so probably quite appealing, right? So it feels like liberation. So watch out for all that, but it's all kind of cleared out, because all of that nonsense on the New Age side is just ego inflation rather than any kind of genuine embodiment, right? The real Sophia consciousness is humble, even in her power. She recognizes her sovereignty without needing to dominate others, without needing to be seen, without needing to be, seen to be powerful. She understands her divinity as something that all beings shared, rather than a special status that elevates her above everyone else. Because the false Shekhinah version will place her atop of anyone else who follows and siphon that energy through. It essentially creates spiritual narcissism. Women who believe they're more evolved, more goddess-like, more awakened than others, which creates exactly the same hierarchy that the Catholic Church set up, right? Yeah, it's saints above sinners, just with awakened goddess at the top instead of the male priest. So the whole thing is that kind of network. So that's that Shekhinah, right, version. And what I've noticed about the false Shekhinah, it's like drama and chaos are the full expressions of that feminine power, right? You'll see the teachings that celebrate being too much, that overwhelm others with emotion, refusing any kind of discipline or structure, as masculine control. Oh, we're going to do away with that. And, treating boundaries as the oppressive patriarchy. The real Sophia creates the wisdom, right? Destroys when necessary, but not carelessly. And brings chaos that serves transformation rather than just destruction for destruction's sake. Where the false Shekhinah, that New Age version I've been ranting on at the moment, justifies the emotional manipulation, the unstable behavior, the harm to others as honoring the wild feminine within, not dimming my light for anyone, right? It's the wounded feminine acting out rather than the integrated sacred feminine creating something new from a conscious perspective. So that's kind of, the picture there on the Shekhinah. You've probably seen so much out there. Once I've spelt it all out for you, you can probably see it as clear as day. I mean, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So hopefully this little rant here has been good, that you can really kind of, see it clearly, because the Sananda and the Shekhinah, now that disillusion of it has really been massive. Because the problem has been the New Age packaged version of the false Shekhinah has targeted women who have been genuinely seeking healing from patriarchal and religious wounding, right? And they're not looking, these women who are trying to get out of the church and the suppression are not looking to manipulate or harm. They're just trying to reclaim the power that the church took from them and that was stolen, right? To heal what was shattered, what was shamed, to reconnect with the feminine divinity that got suppressed through those constructs growing up in a mother or a family that was in the church, right? That false Shekhinah New Age overlay offers what exactly looks like empowerment, right? It's got the right language, empowerment, liberation, sacred sexuality, goddess reclamation, but unfortunately puts them into a different prison. Right? They escape the Catholic cage of suppression to jump into the New Age cage of false empowerment. Still not accessing the real Sophia consciousness, which is the integration of all of it together. Literally, out of the fry pan, into the fire. And that's what I think the brilliance of the synthetic matrix is. It's super intelligent. It ran both overlays simultaneously. It was reinforcing each other through opposition. So that women traumatized by the Catholic Church jump into the New Age empowerment, right? And so they can get kind of caught up in the false goddess on both sides and get their energy siphoned and harvested. So the big thing to recognize is that this has been an incredible 2-3 weeks. The dissolving of the false Sananda consciousness, the dissolving of the false Shekhinah consciousness have been massive constructs that have been cleared out from the morphogenetic field. Anyone, who has been caught up in either of these, and sometimes, we've all been caught up in past lifetimes where we've been caught up in manipulation, caught up in dissolving, caught up in sacrifice, caught up in all these things. It's been going on for hundreds of years, right? This synthetic matrix has been catching us coming and going for thousands of years. Right? It's time to come into a balanced point of view, both in the feminine consciousness and the masculine consciousness. Right? It's time that we are able to find that middle ground, because now that the false Sananda signal is gone and the false Shekhinah signal is gone, there's going to be a new signal in town. Massive amounts of people are going to start to be able to tap into. Right? The problem in the past is people get pressed in every direction because the false matrix bounces them from suppression to false empowerment, right, into every direction except any sort of embodied authenticity. This is why I think the dissolving of the false Shekhinah network is going to create such massive shifts, because they're not being freed from just one version of the trap, they're being freed from both versions of the trap. So the brilliance of being liberated from the track is that the real true consciousness is becoming accessible. People don't have to choose between virgin and whore anymore, between being submissive handmaid and manipulative goddess, between sexual denial and sexual vampirism or sexual liberation, between masculine pleasing softness and destructive chaos. Those polarities are gone, and the real Sophia now is integrated. right? She contains and balances all aspects, expressing what is needed in the moment from a place of wisdom, not from wounding, right? Not from creating and destroying in service to self, but creating and destroying in service to life rather than ego, right? Fierce in love, fierce in her power, right? Fully sexual, fully sacred, without the split, without the shame. And you know, now that I've given this kind of pretty decent schematic, when you look out there in the marketplace, it's everywhere. And now the broadcast system signal's been dissolved. I mean, it's going to be super interesting to see, you know, what's going to happen to both the teachers, and their devotees and the followers, what happen next, right? So yeah, it's going to be super interesting to see what comes. When we looked into the Melchizedek mystical library and got like how many people are caught up in this, again, it's about 1.5 billion people influenced by the false Shekhinah network, all through the church, New Age movement. You know, obviously the Catholic Church is the biggest infrastructure overlay. It's got, you know, so many devoted Catholics around the world a lot of them are on the Virgin Mary programming. Or it's kind of, you know, on the New Age line there. There's you know, probably 30, 40 million people with influence through the New Age, goddess spirituality, false Shekhinah, tantric teachings that are out there. So, but if you count the Sananda and the Shekhinah together, we're talking about a massive, massive, massive overlay. So the question becomes, what is going to be the effects on the planet, right? What is going to change now? You know, so this Operation Golden Return created this massive shift in the planet's frequency, and hopefully this little discourse and me just riffing here is kind of explaining how it all transpired. You know, we had 3 major signals dissolve. We had Crowley, we had false Sananda, we had false Shekhinah. And both of those energetic false signals each had its own signal and programming of control and extraction of frequency, right? What has come out of all this is that our distributed crystal grid network wasn't just important to the Orion Stargate, and while we did achieve our objectives there, you know, high 10s and high 5s for all of that, the real benefit was the creation of our architecture itself, right? We've now got a full stack, the 12 thrones, 2 vaults, the authority on the planet to say the word, the distributed Cristic crystal network to distribute the load. So we've got God's will and authority on the planet. And so this architecture, along with the rest of the architecture in place and more to come, including 3 more vaults, you know, UK and 2 in France, we've got this, you know, architecture growing that more and more large-scale dissolutions with massive global ramifications are going to be able to come. So just with these ones, the false light signals dissolved, what can we see? Well, first up, people are going to come out of a fog, you know, like sudden clarity. To see, people are going to have the clarity to see through confusion that seemingly keep them phase locked in place. You know, for example, that complicated relationship, you know, which has over the years proved to be obviously toxic, people can get themselves out of. Spiritual teacher that someone's following just feels hollow now, or manipulative, right? The job that you convinced yourself was fine, but is clearly soul crushing, you know, you can't unsee it anymore. Basically that mimic fog is lifting. And so people are going to be able to access real discernment for the first time. Right? This is part of the mass awakening that's going to start happening, because instead of synthetic substitutes, they're going to start to get the clear signal. A lot of women around the planet are going to be claiming their power. I mean, it's going to start getting interesting in certain relationships where women have been suppressed by the man in the relationship, making themselves smaller, just suddenly finding they can't stay silent anymore. You know, just with natural authority that knows its worth, knows its value, speaks up without second guessing, ending the relationship without guilt. No, I'm not taking that anymore, right? Expressing sexuality without shame, setting boundaries without apology, right? Because the false Shekhinah's power is unfeminine, right? That programming is breaking down, and the sovereign feminine authority is emerging. So men are going to be discovering that they can relate to empowered women as equals rather than victims, or rather than as someone to be rescued, or rather than threats to be controlled. Right? So they're going to have to start learning to relate to women in a whole new way if they've been caught up in that false Shekhinah. Right? Where women who may be in false power, like people who are teachers who have built up these powerful personas through the New Age movement, or through the Tantra teachings, or the dance movement, or anyone in that false Shekhinah stream, may start having breakdowns as all their synthetic scaffolding starts cracking and collapsing. Right? There's going to be identity crisis. Their followers are not going to feel their message anymore. It's going to try to rebrand or repackage. But again, unless they have a full dissolution, they're still going to build things up on false scaffolding. They're going to come back to their true, authentic selves. But the biggest thing is kind of across the whole planet, spiritual authority is going to be questioned. Right? People will start questioning gurus, ascended master channelings, the church, right? Spiritual teachers, right? From a pure discernment place. Teachings that sound repetitive or manipulative. You know, the enlightened guru suddenly becomes, it's a personality cult, right? This is the false Sananda offline. People beginning to access their own direct divine connection. Recognizing intermediaries isn't just completely unnecessary, you know, at best. Exploitive at worst. I'm just being exploited here. I'm getting out, right? So people are going to start allowing themselves to have sovereign choice over compliance, right? You know, people are going to be less willing to comply with unjust authority. So this is the start of this movement of unplugging from governmental, religious, medical tyranny, medical corporate kind of suppression that's happened. Not through necessarily organized rebellion or resistance, just through billions of people making individual decisions to simply opt out of the system. Right? That synthetic programming that kept people compliant is gone. Right? That was a signal that dumbed people down and put them into the control system. They're going to be able to start making choices based upon their own discernment. People are going to get very difficult to control. That's going to be tough for the synthetic matrix, right? The thing that I'm interested in is the spiritual teacher crisis, right? There's either going to be collapse or transformation. You know, some of the biggest names in the world are unfortunately caught up in tier one oversoul infection, right? False Nanda, false Shekhinah, right? Whether they are New Age goddess or priestesses or ascended master channelers or tantra facilitators or spiritual gurus or whatever, empowerment coaches, that whole network dissolution is going to create this probably existential crisis, because they've built their entire identity and their business and community around these constructs, right? And now the infrastructure's gone. They're facing this super brutal choice, and they're most likely there's three options that they're going to present to leaders and teachers and facilitators who were hijacked up into that inverted stream. You know, so the first option is that they're either going to have an identity crisis and, you know, a true transformation, right? So the honest ones, now that the signal's gone and they can actually get a clear signal, are going to experience first up a lot of disorientation, and their channeling just feels a bit hollow to me now. It kind of stops, and the downloads that they felt are now obviously coming from their own mind or nowhere at all. So the techniques that they used to have that seemed to create these powerful shifts in students are just not working anymore. Now they generate nothing. So some are going to have these complete breakdowns as they realize that they've been actually feeding their, you know, people synthetic spirituality. And so they're going to collapse on that. The second, here's my kids, I've got to quickly wrap this up. The second thing that could happen is that they're either going to double down on their existing path and they're going to start, you know, going even harder, or the third thing is they just keep kind of meandering along as they are, right? So it's kind of like this big crisis point for these teachers who are caught up in this path. So, you know, you've either got to go away, do deeper clearing work, step away from teaching entirely for a while, rebuild from a genuine connection rather than the synthetic frameworks and the synthetic networks. But there's going to be a bunch who double down on the persona, right? And that ain't going to work great because the rest of the audience is not going to resonate anymore with the persona, because people will feel the persona as being hollow. They're just performing spirituality. There's nothing spiritual in that. It's just someone dressed up in fancy costumes speaking all the right words. There's nothing deep coming through. They don't have any spiritual authority over me anymore. So there's going to be a complete loss of energetic substance behind these teachers who are doubling down on it. Hey Noah, I'm just about, give me another 1 or 2 minutes, buddy, and I'm all done. I don't even know how long I've been going for, but it's definitely a decent rant. So that's kind of the double down, and the people who double down, they've lost the hypnosis. The hypnosis is gone because the signal is terminated. So see ya. I don't know what they're going to do, but they're going to have to try to work it out. They might try to go harder on their branding, but basically, their audience, which has basically been their loose shopper for all this time, their devotees are no longer mesmerized by the cult of their personality. So they're going to be kind of gone. So watch for teachers whose content becomes sort of more dramatic, more claims of everything, because they have to go harder and when they double down. And obviously that ain't going to work for all the people who are now off the hypnosis signal. So that's going to be super interesting. A lot of forced charisma trying to replace the false Sananda Shekhinah network, which backed them up. That backup was doing all the heavy lifting for them. It ain't there any longer. So these teachers, they're going to have to sort of, are going to start hemorrhaging students over the coming year or two and beyond, because people's discernment is just going to mean they kind of, this is nonsense, this is new age bullshit, and so they'll probably not accept what's going on and just think people are falling off the wagon. That's the first two. And really the only other option forward for people who are caught up in this is a kind of like a conscious grift that they're going to go through, right? A smaller subset who knew or suspected all along that they were running manipulation rather than genuine spiritual kind of work. For these people who were kind of umming and ahhing whether they're in the true stream or not, they're going to, they might just kind of adjust their marketing a little bit. And they're going to adjust their marketing. They'll rebrand, use different language, create new programs off a different stream, co-opt the language, go further into false spirituality and rebrand themselves, go beyond the false light. But you're going to be able to tell by your nervous system. You're going to feel that these people are saying the right words, but there's no coding in their voice. Your nervous system is going to be able to feel it. And honestly, these people are the most dangerous because they are being consciously predatory. They're going to adapt and rebrand and remarket and use the right mimicked language, and try to catch others into that stream. Mimic is what mimic does. They're just going to look at what's hot in the market, catch up onto that, and copy what others are doing and whatever's working. So watch out for that. So that's enough from me today. I think my family's home after their outing, so I've got my window coming to a close. Thank you for Operation Golden Return. Thousands of crystals logged into Vault 00001, fed through the stargates, moving out through Golden Eagle grid, and then now we've got the full vertical alignment of the thrones, two vaults, and the direct line to source, able to dissolve massive false light constructs. Oh man, I wonder what's going to happen next, but this has been massive. Watch this space. I'm sure there's more to come. All my love.